I've not been shown that.
Let me show you how to. It's just good for you to know
Yeah.
in general.
There's
For both of them,
probably just something you need to turn inside there.
it's simple. It's simple. It's in
Yeah.
there. You just put it
Yeah.
in here, flip it, and this will pop out.
Yeah.
That means it's locked.
Yeah.
And he can set the alarm when he comes back. Also, because
All right. I'm on the sound. It was so, it looked like such a simple thing a little bit earlier when, oh, it's just going to be this informal thing, just a small group tonight. But Rachel pointed out that I'm on live stream. So actually, I am famous. I'm all over the airwaves. Oh, infamous. Well, we will see. Maybe that's true. Something I want to talk about tonight. I want to get a lot of feedback, by the way. I don't know if this is going to work out. When you have a lot of people with a lot of experience in reading the Bible, and I know we have people with a lot of experience reading the Bible, but the more people you get, the more response you can get from difficult questions where I have something in mind and maybe you don't have that something in mind. And so it's like nobody is able to read my mind. So we'll see how that works. I might have to kind of give you the answer to most of what I'm referring to. But if I were to have, or the scriptures we would say would, and God were to have a subject that he could give to us that will make us so that we can avoid huge pitfalls in our life, I think we would want to focus on that. And I know that it's the way for my life that the two greatest processes in our life, and the first one's not really a process, but the two greatest things that happen in a person's life, the first one is salvation. And that feeds right into what the second one is sanctification, which Pastor has asked and you've responded enough times that we all know that that is our Christian growth. That is our daily walk with the Lord. And that feeds right into this. And the two greatest commands are to, well, what are the two greatest commands? I'll start that with a little bit of feedback. Okay, love one another. That's the second greatest command because the first one is love God as with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength. So number one is to love God, and number two is to love your neighbor. And when we love God and love our neighbor, we're going to serve God, we're going to obey God, we're going to please God. When we love our neighbor, we are going to want to not, well, in effect, serve, yes, not in the same way as God, but we're going to love, serve, and want to do things for our neighbor, which is just everybody around us. So I'm going to look at something that will feed into every one of those things, and it's something that I think I'm right about this. It plagues every one of us. I know it's something I have to always be looking out for, and it's throughout the Bible as a pitfall that we see. And this subject is excuses. Maybe I'm the only one here, but I don't think so. But when you get trapped in a corner, when you've done something wrong, when you're asked to do something you really don't want to do, don't you tend to want to look for an excuse? I know I do. I know, something looks real bad on you, and it's like, he did it. It's like what was the old Flip Wilson saying? You probably heard that from the 60s or whenever that was. The devil made me do it. Well, there's one of them. But I have a whole series of things that I've developed. I'm not going to give you that tonight, but I'm going to give you one little part of it. But a whole series of things I've developed from people in the Bible that have used excuses. And when you see it from the outside, you can kind of laugh at it and you can say, well, that's really stupid. And you don't realize that's me when someone else is looking at it, that it destroys your credibility and it takes you out of service. Before we get into the ones in the Bible, though, we'll kind of laugh at the ones that I brought up on the internet. There are better ones than this, but these are excuses why people didn't go into work. Some of them are almost halfway legitimate excuses. There is such a thing as a legitimate excuse. I'm not saying that that's impossible, but usually it's not legitimate. First one is the employee didn't want to lose the front of his house, so that's why he didn't go into work that morning. Employee hit a turkey while riding a bike. I don't know if it knocked him off his bike. I don't know what the recovery time was for that, but kind of unusual. Employee said he had a heart attack early that morning, but that he was all better now. You know, if I was the boss, I'd say, "You're all better now? Well, come on in." Employee donated too much blood. I think they monitor how much is coming out, and I don't know. Employee's dog was stressed out after a family reunion. So sometimes the pets get involved. I know in school, the old excuse was the dog ate my homework. You know, I taught school for 27 years, and that's the excuse you say, you hear is always. I never once heard that one. The funniest excuse I heard when I was in school, not for homework not being done, but just a general excuse, is there was kind of a time when they were able to talk. It was kind of a break time. And there was a brother and a sister, both in the same class. And the brother was talking to somebody. I just happened to be there at the moment. The brother was talking about a fish he caught. And he said, I caught a fish that was this big. And his sister was there, and she was ready to correct him. And he said, oh, I didn't see that hand, that other hand. It's like he didn't realize where he was holding that hand. Let me correct that a little bit. But that was a real one. That was one I witnessed. Here's another. Employee was kicked by a deer. So wildlife is involved in more than one of these. Employee contracted mono after kissing a mailroom intern at the party and suggested the company post some sort of notice to warn others who may have kissed him. So I would not want to be that mailroom intern when that post went up, probably. Well, I would never be that mailroom intern anyway, especially since it's a girl. But employee, oh no, that was a guy. But anyway, employee swallowed too much mouthwash. I never realized how powerful that was. Employee's wife burnt all his clothes and he had nothing to wear to work. I think probably his relationship with his wife is probably the biggest thing there. He might have been able to find something. Oh, is that one you've used? No. Oh. No, these are supposed to be real ones. I mean, you can't believe everything on the internet. You may have heard that before, but I was not about to research whether these are, there's probably no way to research that. So I'm just, hey, they're supposed to be real. It would be a waste of time sharing them if they weren't real. I mean, there's no point of making them up except for the person that originally made them up. Yeah. And I just have three more. Employee's toe was injured when a soda can fell out of the refrigerator. Now, if that employee, a lot of it had to do with being on their feet, that could have been legitimate. My wife had one of those big, I don't know, it's bigger than quart, I think it's a half-gallon cans of pineapple juice, dropped it on her toe, it broke her toe. So, Annie, I think she went into work the next day that she was supposed to, though. Employee was up all night because the police were investigating the death of someone discovered behind her house. I can kind of understand. I mean, there are people that don't sleep at night and the next day they can go into work, but I think she was probably a little bit rattled, wasn't she? And then the last one, employee's psychic told her to stay home. Yeah, that's the best one. Anyway, we can laugh at them, but you know what? Well, maybe not those would be us, but we do come up with excuses because it's human nature. We're looking for a way out. And we see that because it's so much in the Bible. I want to look at some of the other examples of some people before I get into the main one I want to talk about. There are different sections of history in the Bible. The first part of history is the creation part in Genesis. And can anybody think of someone, actually a couple people that came up with some excuses, which is passing the buck in that section of scripture, the creation? Yes, in Genesis. Again, this is where you have to read my mind to know, but this is one of the easier ones, okay? Yeah, Adam and Eve. Okay, so God went to Adam, and Adam said, it's the wife that you gave to me, which that's a little bit of a loaded thing there, by the wife that you gave me. And then secondly, he goes to Eve, and she says, well, it's the serpent. And so that's a pass the buck. Then the next time of history was the patriarchs. We have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I don't have any great examples from there. But after that, we had the time of Moses. Can anybody think of an excuse during that time? Yeah, so we go straight to Moses himself. And that's the one I'm going to focus on later. And I like the way you said specifically it's the excuse that he couldn't speak well. He was not eloquent. And that's what we would all come up with as its excuse. But the funny thing is, when you look at that section of scripture, and Pastor just recently taught on that section, and everybody, you could have a dozen people teach on the same section, come up with different angles and different things. But if you look at it closely, he didn't come up with one excuse. He came up with 5 of them. And it covers a period of a chapter and a half in our Bibles. But then also another person during that same time period was Aaron. Remember, with the golden calf? He came up with some of the most ridiculous excuses that there are. There was the passing the buck excuse, saying the people wanted this. And then there was an outright lie in that he said that I threw gold into the fire and out came this calf. He crafted it, it says in the scripture, but that was his story, is out came this calf. And how can you argue with a miracle like that? But it didn't happen. And then the next time period in the Bible was the period of the judges. And I don't expect you to come up with what was in my mind on this one. There were about a dozen judges during that time. But with Gideon, he doubted. He said, if the Lord be with us, then why is all this befallen us? In other words, we don't see the miracles we used to see in the past. He specifically brought that up. So he had doubt. It's like, God, you didn't seem to have been here. How can this be for real? And then he had excuse, he had no position. My family is the least in Israel, and I'm in the least in my family. And he had the excuse of a lack of faith. He needed a sign. In fact, he needed 3 signs. We usually think of one sign he asked for, and what was that? The sign that that Gideon wanted from God, that it was for real. The fleece, sure. But that itself was 2 signs because he asked for it twice in opposite ways. But before the fleece, God consumed a sacrifice with fire. Actually, it was a meal, but he consumed it with fire. I mean, that's a pretty good sign right there. But he needed the fleece to further back that up. Then also we have the time of the kings. And some of the other most ridiculous excuses came from Saul on 2 different occasions. One of those occasions, the first of those occasions, was when he offered a sacrifice, that which only the priest could do. You might say, but he's the king, he can do anything. Well, no, it was a theocracy. And sure, during the times of the later kings, when almost all of them were bad, they were all doing wrong things. But he was the very first king. God had just set up the law, very first king. But he did the passing the buck thing. That's the most common excuse. So guess what? It probably is for us. Who made me do it? Kind of a thing. But he did the passing the buck, and twice he did that the people asked for me to do this. And then circumstances. Well, the enemy was gathering around, and our people were leaving. And so he used the term, I forced myself. In other words, I didn't really want to do what was wrong, but I made myself do what was wrong. So I have this, morality inside of me, but I had to because of circumstances. And then the second occasion with Saul was when God told him to completely destroy these heathen people and not take anything. And he came in to try to excuse himself with something that sounded very religious, and it was an outright lie. He knew he had done something wrong, so he had to come in sounding very pious. And these are the words, blessed be thou of the Lord. I have performed the commandment of the Lord. You know that something's wrong when he kind of comes in with that much pious language. So actually, he bunch of this, and he took the king um, and um, and had not obeyed the commandment of the Lord. Then he passed the buck again. That was the third time he did it. He said the people wanted these things, and he said it was for a sacrifice. Can you imagine disobeying God so that you can please him? So it was for a sacrifice. So you got the religiosity again there, the piousness. And then blindness. He came back again and said, yea, I have obeyed, and I have brought Agag, the king. It's like, how do you put those two things in one sentence? God said, destroy everything, destroy the king. Yea, I have obeyed, and I have brought Agag. He actually used that in the sentence there. And then he passed the buck once again. He said the people made me do it. He's the king. The people made me do it. So that's actually 4 times he passed the buck. And then we have New Testament teachings. We have, can anybody think of the perfect example of a parable that Christ told that is excuse making? 3 different people that made excuses. They were invited to a dinner, a feast. Okay, well, I looked at it again. I thought it was a wedding because there's one similar. There are a couple similar, but this was just a feast. It was a dinner. And there was one that said he had these worldly cares he needed to tend to, and another was business, and another was family. And then you have a good example in Acts chapter 24 with a governor that actually did not accept the Lord because of his excuse that he wasn't ready. You don't have to get ready to accept the Lord. that goes contrary to what accepting the Lord is, because you come just as I am, as the song says. But he said, when I have a more convenient season, I will call for thee. He wasn't ready. So we're going to look at Moses, though, Exodus chapter 3, and you might kind of be enlightened by this if you went into this thinking he only had one excuse. He had 5 excuses. You might say 4, or you might say 5, depending on whether you consider one of them as an excuse. But in Exodus chapter 3, we have this account, and we have the first excuse in verse 10 and 11. Exodus 3, 10 and 11. It says, come now, therefore, and I will send thee unto Pharaoh, that thou mayest bring forth my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. And Moses said unto God, who am I that I should go unto Pharaoh, and that I should bring forth the children of Israel out of Egypt? That sounds rather argumentative to me. I mean, don't you think God kind of thought it through and wasn't just kind of jumping in the dark there, like God wasn't ready to slap himself in the head and say, yeah, what was I thinking? But that's rather argumentative. And by the way, who would be better to represent Israel than Moses? He's the connection. He was raised in Pharaoh's household, but he was a pure Israelite. But that was his excuse. He had no position of authority. Guess what? God gave him the position of authority. What is a position of authority? You know, in other words, think of it this way. He said, I have no human that has set me up as an authority, as his excuse for God can't set him up as an authority. Do you see the problem with that? It doesn't make any sense. But you know what? We would tend to do that. God calls us for something that's over our head, which is, by the way, what he specializes in doing. Because if it's not over our head, we would tend to do it in our own strength. He wants us to rely on him. I got a great quote here. If you hadn't heard it before, you're about to hear it right now. Isn't that deep? No, actually, if you hadn't heard it before, it's a very quotable type of thing that you might want to remember or even jot down. God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. Has anybody heard that before? You can raise your hand and see. I thought it might be at least half of you. Let me say it again so you can think it through. God does not call the qualified, he qualifies the called. In other words, he'll take someone that doesn't think they can do something, and he puts them in a position that through God's strength, they can do it. Therefore, they're relying on him. He becomes, strength is made perfect in weakness, is one of the terms we can use from God's rejection of the Apostle Paul with the thorn in his flesh, in his side, and he asked 3 times to have it relieved, and God said no, and he said, I will, strength comes through weakness. But that was his first excuse, no position of authority. When God calls you to do something that seems beyond you, think about that. Should I give as dumb an excuse as Moses did, that because a person hasn't qualified me, therefore God can't qualify me? That's really what it's getting down to. The second excuse comes in chapter 4 and verse 1. Well, what happened? Well, excuse me, chapter 3 and verse 13. Here's the one that you might say, okay, this is not really an excuse. And I thought through this, both sides of it. And I think it's because of all the other excuses, it qualifies him as an excuse. If this was the last thing he said, and then he went and followed God's will and obeyed him, I'd say that's just a preparation. It's not an excuse. But because it was one in a line as number 2 in a line of 4 others following, I think it was an excuse. But in verse 13, God spent some time explaining how God gives him the position of authority. And in verse 13, and Moses said unto God, behold, when I come unto the children of Israel, notice he's acting like he's ready to do it. And if he was ready to do it, this would be legitimate, but we see later he wasn't. When I come unto the children of Israel, it doesn't even say if, it says when. And shall say unto them, the God of your fathers has sent me unto you, and they shall say to me, what is his name? What shall I say unto them? And God goes through that great, if you haven't highlighted verse 14, that's where God identifies himself as Jehovah, or you might use the term Yahweh. In other words, I am that I am, meaning his name means the self-existent one who has always existed throughout all of eternity. That's one way to put it. It's a description of God, the best description that we could have. But the interesting thing is, when we're asked to do something and we want to look like our heart is in it, that we want to do it, and we're grasping at things, and I got to come up with some way out of this thing, we're going to come up with questions. And this is a pretty legitimate question on the surface, but you can see how, and I do this myself, I can come up with conversations in my head. It's like I'm going to picture myself, going before Pharaoh or going before Israel, say, I'm going to be your deliverer and that kind of thing. Okay, what could be the problem? What do I have to watch out for? And so you can see he actually came up with a conversation back and forth that if I say this to them and they ask me this question, then what am I going to say to them? And so that was his second excuse, is we could call that ignorance or lack of information, that I just want more before I'm ready to go. Again, you might say that's legitimate, and perhaps it was, but I say maybe not because of what we see next. Chapter 4 and verse 1. And Moses answered and said, okay, by the way, the Lord used verse 14 through 22 in talking about how he has this whole thing planned out. I'm not going to read that whole thing, but it, look in verse 22. It's interesting. It's God obviously sees the past, present, and future. He's eternal. If you haven't heard it described this way, the eternality of God is beyond our understanding, because we live in time and space and we can't conceive of it. But not only does God know the past, present, and future, and know us better than we know ourselves, he knows every detail and all the interactions of every detail of every one of the over 7 billion people in the world and all the other billions of people that ever existed on the earth. He knows all of that. But it's like he's experiencing right now with all the knowledge and understanding involved in that experience that you could possibly have. That's the extent to what his eternal understanding and knowledge is. And I didn't even do a justice to that description. But when you look at chapter 4 and or chapter 3 and verse 22, he says what's going to happen. In fact, let's go back to verse 20. We'll just go to the end of that chapter, chapter 3, verse 20. And I will stretch out my hand and smite the Egyptians with all my wonders, which I will do in the midst thereof. And after that, he will let you go. So he's saying what he knows that Pharaoh will do. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And shall come to pass that when you go, ye shall not go empty. So this was like a miracle. When is it that you defy the leader of a country and all the people give you stuff as you go away? There was no logical, reasonable explanation for it, but God said that would happen, and it did happen. And it says, and by the way, these are people that they worked for. They didn't just work for Pharaoh. They worked for all the citizens of that country. They were slaves to those people, and they said, I'm getting out of here. And they were giving them stuff, just like God said. And then verse 22, but every woman shall borrow of her neighbor. That word borrow, it could be in quotes. In other words, they're gone for good. Borrow of their neighbor. And of her that sojourneth in her house, jewels of silver and jewels of gold and raiment. And ye shall put them upon your sons and upon your daughters, and ye shall spoil the Egyptians. Not like you would spoil a little child and give them ice cream, but you shall take of their spoils is the idea there. So God says, I got all this covered. I think I'm good with all this. It goes back to this thing where Moses, you see how ridiculous it is now when Moses said, but I have no position of authority. So he didn't say you didn't think everything through, Lord, but kind of the concept is there. But yeah, God has everything under control. Chapter 4 and verse 1, we go back to the no credibility thing, which is very similar to no position of authority. But you could have a position of authority and no credibility. I won't get into any details of what we find in Washington, D.C., but I think that might give you an indication that there are people that have a position of authority and no credibility. But Moses answered and said, but behold, they will not believe me, nor hearken unto my voice, for they will say, the Lord hath not appeared unto thee. So he's thinking again, okay, I'm picturing myself going into them again. Maybe not to Pharaoh, but to my people. And what might their reaction be? Oh, yeah, that's it. They won't believe me. What gives them reason to believe me? Again, right after God says, I've taken care of every detail. You know what, Moses? How did we get to the point where I had all these plagues, he's going to let you go, they're going to give you a bunch of stuff, and you're out of there. How do I get to that point that I know is going to happen if they're not believing you? You think I can take care of that along the way? Isn't that kind of a necessary thing along the way to getting to that final place that I know is going to happen? So you can see how ridiculous that excuse is. Then the next excuse is the one that sticks in our mind. I don't know why. It's the famous one, no eloquence. Chapter 4 and verse 10 says, and Moses said unto the Lord, O my Lord. And I looked this up. This is a powerful statement that doesn't come through in the English. This is when somebody is very, very, very distressed, will use the kind of language that's used here. So you can see, man, God's taken everything away from me. I have no real excuse. Oh, yeah, here, I got one. Oh, my Lord, I am not eloquent, neither heretofore, nor since thou hast spoken unto thy servant. You know, this kind of reminds me of Adam when he says it's the woman, not just the woman which you gave me. What he's saying is, I wasn't too good of a speaker when you showed up just now, and that hasn't changed since you've been talking to me. It's not like you've done a miracle since you showed up. I don't see any change happening here. So a little bit of blame, like, I don't see you starting anything yet with this speech problem I got here. It says, but I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Now, people have commentated on what that means. I'm guessing it means very little because it was his fourth excuse. If he was absolutely tongue-tied or just had a real significant problem, it would have been his first excuse probably. Not only that, but when you see him actually in action, when he finally agrees, God gets angry with him after a while, and he finally agrees to go forward. And there were the 10 plagues, and he had to approach Pharaoh. And, God gave him Aaron to be a spokesperson. When you look into that story, it's very interesting because the first couple plagues, it's Aaron that approaches Pharaoh and speaks. And then Moses takes over from then. It's like, okay, I've kind of proven my point that I needed Aaron because I wanted to back up what I had to say here about not being eloquent. But I'm ready to go ahead now. And you know what? God never asked him to be eloquent. He asked him to say, let my people go. He asked him to tell Israel that he was doing a work among them. He didn't have to use flowery language for that. We don't have to be the best musician in the world, for instance, for God to use us to bless people. He uses what we've got now. Of course, you need to be reasonable about it. You don't want people to have to suffer through 3 minutes of a special when they're thinking, oh, I hope they make it through this. They look like they're suffering so, and I'm suffering so because it sounds horrible. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often. But no, eloquence is not what God was looking for. And probably the main thing here, he says he's slow of tongue. I can understand probably what he's dealing with here. He needed to speak in the Hebrew tongue to be that connection between the Hebrews and Pharaoh. And surely Pharaoh knew their tongue. They were his servants. But this is on the back end of Moses being on the backside of the wilderness for 40 years and in the household of Pharaoh where they were all speaking the Egyptian tongue. It's not like he was among the Hebrew people all this time. It was semi-foreign language after decades of being away from that. So you think about it, how many of you can speak a little bit of a second language? Okay, you can speak a little bit of a second language. But and I'm in the boat of most of you. I can't. But it would make it a lot more difficult, and I would be slow of tongue if I'm trying to come up with words I was unsure of, and it was a second language. But anyway, we need to move on to the next one. And this is verse 13. This is when God gets impatient, we could say, in a human way. He said, O my Lord, send, I pray thee, by the hand of him whom thou wilt send. You could read that like 10 times and not really make a whole lot of sense out of it. Basically, I think he's saying, you're sending the wrong person. Find somebody else. Because that's the only sense you can make of it. There he was very, very desperate and couldn't come up with anything else really. Because God said that he would provide for him. And there we have verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses. We don't need that to happen with us. Because you know what? He's going to do God's will anyway. And guess who we know of? I think it's about 6,000 years later. I think Moses, let me see the dates. This was about 1500 BC. So this about 6,500 years later. We know this guy named Moses, and we know a nation called Israel. And he kind of did something really great, didn't he? It turned out well. And so first of all, it'll turn out well if we do God's will. Second of all, we don't need him to be upset with us. We're going to do it anyway. It says, the Lord said in verse 14, is not Aaron the Levite thy brother? I know that he can speak well. So it's like God said, okay, some of this will be deflected off of you and onto him. It says, and also, behold, he cometh forth to meet thee, and when he seeth thee, he will be glad in his heart. Ultimately, Moses, we all know, was the spokesperson. We have an interesting verse in the book of Acts where Joseph recounted, I said that wrong, Joseph. Oh yeah, it was Joseph. Or Stephen, I'm sorry. Stephen recounted when he was about to be martyred, he recounted the history of Israel as he was making his defense. And he said that Moses was strong in word and deed. And we find this as it was reflected back on, that he was strong in word and deed. And so we see what the truth of the matter is. I brought something out of this too that I'd never thought of before. As many times as I looked at this, and I've given this lesson before in other places, and never saw this before, but there is a great irony about this part of his eloquence that I don't want you to miss, because I kind of had to laugh at myself when I finally found it. The irony of his excuse for lack of eloquence is that as he was giving that excuse, he was using his tongue to debate God. Do you get it? It's like, I don't talk too well, and I'm going to state my case before God and try to win this argument. He was debating God, telling him that he doesn't speak too well. Massive irony there. So, you know what? We really look silly when we try to make excuses, and it's really well beyond that. It's silliness is not the real problem here. The problem is the fact that that's where we go to when God asks us to do things that we don't want to do, whether it's serving him or serving others. The two greatest things in our life, the two greatest commands: love God and love others. When you love God and love others, love isn't this, well, it is, but God's kind of love that we're talking about in the scriptures, the agape kind of love, is not the love where you get this funny little feeling in your stomach because, oh, she's so pretty, or oh, he's so handsome, and everything they do is wonderful, and that kind of thing. God's love that we're talking about is a love that gives. We find it in 1 Corinthians 13. It's all about giving of yourself. And so when God asks you to give of yourself, a lot of times we're busy. Excuse, it comes right off the bat, but we're busy, or we are, whatever the excuse is, we don't often want to do it. And you know what? When you find out that you're doing it, the excuses tend to be less often. We can get in a pattern where they're less often, because when you're serving others and serving God, God's going to bless you in an amazing way. He's going to show you people that you can just make their day just by a simple word of encouragement. Sometimes he'll ask you to give a simple word of encouragement. And I've even found this even with my wife, is that, you know, I could take a moment to say something that'll really make her day. Why would I pass that up? There are great dividends in that besides, but why would I pass that up? But I have passed that up. And you could say somebody just at a checkout or whatever it might be, and you know what? That might be a 10-second moment, but they might get home at the end of that 8-hour shift or whatever it is, and it happened 5 hours ago, and they might tell their spouse, there was this nice person that told me such and such, and it really made my day. You might say, well, that wouldn't happen. Well, yes, it would. I think it's happened to you. It just doesn't happen very often because people don't do it very much. And just give a word of encouragement. It can be so simple. But you know, God is asking us to do things all the time, and we're rejecting it because I'm too busy, or because, no, that won't really help them that much. You know, go ahead, Fran. Yeah, even a smile. You know, they see so many people pass that just miserable looking. It's people have all sorts of worries that they're carrying on their shoulders constantly. Okay, Judy. I didn't mean to make you cry. That makes me feel so bad. No, I'm just kidding. But I saw an interesting video out on the internet. Yeah, I appreciate that. It's good to hear that. But I saw an interesting video on the internet where it had somebody just passing people through the day that you just don't even think twice about it. And they might have a smile on their face, or they might just look like a regular person. And then they showed the video again, and it had a caption of what they're going through. And these people, every day, you really are passing people like that had a loved one that just passed away, or just went into the hospital with the news that they have cancer they're about to deal with, or somebody that just lost their job, or is about to lose their house because they can't make their payments, or they're in the middle of a divorce. Um, all of those things are not even rare. They're happening all around us. And you know what? God's asking us to minister to people, and He's asking us to do things for Him that we would tend to say no, and we kind of let ourselves do it because it's not this face-to-face conversation that Moses had. We can kind of do it because it's like, you're just a voice in my head, and I'm not sure if this is real, so no, 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 kind of a thing. It's like, I think when God is speaking to you, He's not going to let you alone. And when He comes back and speaks again, you just need to do it. So any other comments or things that would be helpful for this, and then we'll be finished. As a teacher, you had to have come up with some great excuses you've heard. Yeah. It's hard to come up with them specifically. I came up with a specific one. I think it's before you popped in here, but it's one that I remembered through the years. It was probably like 15 years ago, and I still remember it, but it was pretty funny. It was as a brother and sister, both in the same classroom, and the brother was telling the class about, or telling kids around him about this fish that he caught. I caught a fish that was this big, and then he caught his eye as his sister was coming around and about to correct him on that, and he looked and he said, "Oh, I didn't see that hand." It's like, I didn't realize that hand was stretched out. There we go. That's what I meant. And I just thought that was so funny because his sister caught him on it. That's just what Moses did, and Adam. Yeah, it's human nature, and we see it in others, and we don't see it in ourselves. What we need to do is be more alert to when we're doing it ourselves and say, this is wrong. I just need to back up a little bit and make this right, because if you're like me, we all do it. I know that probably the one that I'm guilty of, probably catching myself on more than any other, is that the running late excuse. That I've seen myself do this. I'm running late, and it's like, I'm going to push the speed limit as far as I can and get away with it. And then there's a little slowdown in traffic, like the back end of an accident that slowed me down 2 or 3 minutes. And it's like, yes, I can say there was an accident. There's my excuse. But yeah, I've done that. Let's go ahead and close in prayer, and then we'll talk about a request. Our Father, we thank you for this opportunity to see something that we can laugh at, and at the same time we can be sad about, because it's something that affects our life in a very negative way, and it really takes away our credibility because people see it. We don't think they do, but we see it as we look at other people, and it's something that you can get angry at as you did Moses. So we just pray that you'll help us to do your will. It feeds into our sanctification, obeying you. Obedience is so important. So we just pray that you'll help this lesson to be a part of our lives. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen.